In the heart of a flourishing African village, where the streets were lined with clay homes adorned with intricate carvings and vibrant markets spilled with the colors of ripe fruits, the rhythm of life was both lively and orderly. Wealth and hierarchy were evident in every corner. The elders' homes stood tall, painted with the earth's richest hues, while those of the common folk bore the marks of humble labor. Traders chattered in the marketplaces, children ran barefoot along dusty lanes, and the scent of roasted grains and herbs mingled in the warm air. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity, shadows of envy and quiet cruelty moved unseen, curling in corners where no light fell, observing the unsuspecting with silent patience. Amidst this bustling village lived a young girl, no older than 17, whose gentle presence and bright spirit drew admiration from those who truly noticed her. Her name, though seldom mentioned aloud, was whispered with warmth among neighbors and friends who remembered the kindness her late mother had shown. She had inherited her mother's gentle hands, her soft eyes, and a heart that sought always to mend rather than harm. Her laughter, though rarely loud, carried a quiet warmth, a melody that seemed to soften the edges of hardship for anyone near her. Yet for all her brightness, she lived in a home that was far from welcoming, a house that now echoed with the cold dominance of a woman who bore no love for her stepdaughter. The stepmother, newly wed into the household after her mother's passing, carried a beauty that was sharp and commanding, but her eyes were quick to narrow with suspicion and jealousy. She watched the girl's every movement, every smile, as though it were a theft against her own pride. Where neighbors saw a child blossoming, the stepmother saw a rival, a mirror that reflected all that she lacked: warmth, grace, and the affection of a community that had once revered the girl's mother. Her jealousy, quiet at first, began to manifest in subtle ways: a sharp word here, a dismissive gesture there, a lingering gaze that spoke of discontent. Though the girl tried to maintain her brightness, the creeping shadow of cruelty began to taint her days. Chores that once were manageable became endless, her opinions dismissed, her laughter greeted with scorn. She could feel the weight of eyes upon her, not all of them human. Whispers of destiny, faint but present, seemed to watch from the winds that danced through the village and the leaves of the towering trees. The spirits of the ancestors, ever silent observers, seemed to murmur among themselves, as though aware that the young girl's life was being shaped by forces both cruel and unseen. In this village of prosperity and pretense, where wealth painted smiles over hidden malice, the young girl stood poised on the edge of sorrow and endurance. The house of shadows was closing in, yet the quiet strength within her glimmered faintly, as if destiny itself had reserved a place for her to rise beyond the cruelty that threatened to consume her. The air seemed charged with anticipation, hinting at a future that would not allow injustice to linger unchallenged, and at a tale that would someday echo far beyond the boundaries of her small, shadowed home. The days in the house grew heavier, each one blending into the next as the young girl's life became a relentless cycle of labor and humiliation. From the moment the sun stretched its golden fingers across the village to the dimming light of dusk, her hands were never still. She swept the floors until the dust glittered like fine sand, scrubbed the clay walls until her fingers ached, and prepared meals that were never enough to appease the sharp tongue of her stepmother. The chores seemed endless, as if the house itself conspired with the stepmother to exhaust her, draining the color from her cheeks and the light from her eyes. There was no pause, no moment to rest, and certainly no room for the laughter or joy that had once defined her spirit. The stepmother's cruelty was never loud, it thrived in subtlety. A sharp remark about her clumsy movements here, a rolling of the eyes there, an ever-present reminder that she was unwanted and incapable. If she hesitated even for a moment, the stepmother would snatch a cloth or a bowl, toss it at her feet, and sneer as though her mere existence was a mistake. Meals were meager, served without care or warmth, and sometimes withheld entirely when the girl's fatigue tempted her to linger over her own hunger. The home, once a sanctuary, had become a place of silent judgment, a cage in which every corner seemed to watch her fail. Yet the cruelty was not limited to the physical demands of labor. The stepmother excelled in humiliation, a quiet predator who took pleasure in diminishing her stepdaughter before others. She mocked her manners, her voice, even her memories of her late mother, twisting them into stories of incompetence and shame. Should any neighbor or villager glance toward the girl with sympathy, the stepmother's sharp eyes would narrow, a silent warning that kindness would not be tolerated. In the market, at the well, or even near the village square, whispers of disapproval followed the young girl like shadows, spreading tales of a child who was lazy or spoiled, though none had truly witnessed her actions. Despite her suffering, some villagers noticed the weight she carried: the bowed shoulders, the weary movements, the silence that had replaced her once bright laughter. Yet most dismissed it as ordinary family strife, the sort of tension that inevitably arose in blended households. Gossip occasionally sparked, but it never escalated for fear of offending the stepmother or disrupting the fragile balance of social appearances. People assumed her servitude was a normal expectation, that the girl simply needed to learn discipline or humility. In truth, few understood the depth of her oppression or the quiet fortitude that sustained her each day. In the privacy of her small corner of the house, she allowed herself brief moments of reflection, glimpses of her former self that whispered promises of endurance. She remembered her mother's gentle guidance, the stories of ancestors who had faced trials and risen stronger, and the soft hum of the wind through the village trees that seemed to carry encouragement. These fleeting recollections became small fires in her chest, sparks that refused to be extinguished, even under the weight of unending labor and daily derision. And so, life continued under the stepmother's rule, a mixture of toil, silent suffering, and the subtle sting of ridicule. Yet for every mock gesture, every denied meal and every isolating task, the girl's resolve grew. The villagers might see only a child overworked, diminished, and alone, but beneath the layers of sorrow, a quiet strength was forming. A strength that would one day rise, unannounced, with the power to challenge the cruelty that had defined her days. The House of Shadows held her body in service, but it could not contain the spirit quietly shaping itself in resistance. Each day in the household began before the sun had fully risen, the young girl rising from her modest sleeping mat with muscles aching and eyes heavy with exhaustion. The air was thick with the sense of cooking dust, and the lingering presence of her stepmother's disdain. From dawn until the stars claimed the sky, she moved tirelessly, fulfilling endless tasks that seemed designed to test the limits of her body and spirit. She swept, scrubbed, carried heavy bundles of water, tended to livestock, and prepared countless meals for those who regarded her with indifference, or worse, open contempt. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a constant reminder of her lowly status, yet it never broke her resolve. Every ache and pang became a rhythm she had to endure, a silent teacher shaping patience and persistence. Despite the relentless labor and physical strain, her spirit remained unbroken. She drew strength from memories of her mother, who had once wrapped her in warmth and whispered tales of resilience and hope. The stories of ancestors, heroes, and wise women echoed in her mind, becoming invisible threads that tethered her to courage and endurance. Even when her stepmother's words cut sharper than a blade, she would recall those voices and remember that suffering was not a measure of worth, but a forge where character was tempered. The girl's heart, though bruised and tested, pulsed with quiet determination, resisting the despair that threatened to seep into her bones. Her suffering was not without moments of subtle defiance, small sparks that went unnoticed by her oppressors. She would pause just for a heartbeat to straighten her posture or to hum softly a tune her mother had taught her, as if asserting, "I exist and I will not be erased." When carrying water or firewood, she would sometimes deliberately place her burdens in a pattern that mimicked the constellations, reminding herself that she was part of a larger universe, and her life held meaning beyond the confines of the household. Each small act of autonomy, though invisible to others, fed an inner fire, quietly building strength and resolve that no whip, glare, or insult could extinguish. The villagers occasionally glimpsed her from afar, noting her worn clothes, tired movements, and bowed shoulders, yet few understood the depth of her endurance. They assumed she was merely obedient, accustomed to her lot, or perhaps naturally timid. They could not perceive the quiet rebellion thriving in her heart, the invisible fortress of resilience she was constructing one arduous day at a time. In these small, private moments, she honed the discipline and foresight that would one day serve her in ways far beyond mere survival. Her hunger, both physical and emotional, became a strange ally. It heightened her awareness, sharpened her senses, and deepened her empathy for others who suffered in silence. As she moved through the house, she observed the dynamics of her stepmother's household, memorizing routines, weaknesses, and the ways in which power could be asserted and subverted. In her mind, she was learning, planning, and preparing even while performing tasks that appeared mundane or humiliating. The young girl's resilience was a quiet storm, building slowly, imperceptibly. Though outwardly she appeared small, fatigued, and powerless, each act of endurance, each recollection of her mother's words, and each secret spark of defiance contributed to an unseen strength. The stepmother believed she had broken the girl, yet within her, a force was growing, silent, steady, and unstoppable. She endured hardship not merely to survive, but to gather the power and insight she would one day wield, transforming pain into wisdom, labor into strategy, and suffering into the seed of triumph. As the days of servitude stretched into months, Subtle signs began to stir around the young girl, small threads of destiny woven into the ordinary fabric of her life. One night, exhausted from her chores, she fell into a deep sleep beside the fading embers of the hearth. In her dreams, the air shimmered with golden light, and the familiar voice of her mother whispered through the rustling leaves outside her window. The words were not commands or reminders but gentle affirmations. "You are more than you see. You are the flame that no darkness can touch." She woke with a start, heart pounding, the echo of those words lingering as if they had settled within her bones. Though her stepmother scowled at her every movement, she felt a growing sense of guidance, as though unseen hands were arranging the pieces of her fate. During the following days, she began to notice other signs that spoke of something greater than her immediate suffering. Birds seemed to circle above her when she labored, their songs forming patterns that her mind, half dreaming, tried to interpret. Streams of water glistened unusually bright, reflecting the sunlight in a way that made her feel she was being watched, not with malice but with care. When she touched the earth in her daily chores, the soil beneath her fingers felt warm and receptive, as if absorbing her sorrow and transforming it into quiet strength. These hints from nature whispered of hidden potential and a life yet to be claimed, showing her that her existence was significant far beyond the small household she had been trapped in. Ancestors, whose stories had been told by her mother in fleeting moments of tenderness, seemed to reach out in ways she could feel rather than hear. In fleeting glimpses of smoke from the cooking fire or flickers of candlelight, she perceived shapes and movements that conveyed encouragement, not fear. Sometimes at night, as she lay beneath the open sky, the constellations appeared to shift subtly, tracing paths she had never noticed before. It was as though the universe itself was offering her guidance, mapping a future where her suffering could be turned into strength. Each whisper of wind, every rustling leaf, carried the weight of wisdom and the message of endurance. She was chosen for something beyond ordinary life. With every spiritual hint, a subtle clarity emerged. She began to understand the depth of injustice she had endured, recognizing how cruelty had sought to suppress her, not merely to harm her body but to steal her essence. Yet she also perceived the opportunities hidden within her trials. Each humiliating chore, each harsh word, each sleepless night under her stepmother's gaze, was part of the tapestry that prepared her for transformation. The pain, while real and sharp, became a forge for courage, patience, and resilience. She realized that while her stepmother sought to diminish her, a power far greater than human malice was awakening within. These realizations filled her with quiet hope, a spark that she guarded carefully. She dared not speak aloud of what she felt. Her stepmother would have mocked or punished her. Instead, she allowed the signs to guide her actions subtly. She observed the household, noting the routines, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities of those who believed they held power over her. Every movement, every whispered thought, became a meditation on the life she was meant to claim. In her mind, she rehearsed possibilities, imagining herself stepping from the shadows into a role of authority, dignity, and recognition. Even the smallest encounters carried significance. When a neighbor offered a fleeting smile, it was a reminder that kindness existed and could be nurtured. When a bird dropped a bright feather near her feet, it was interpreted as a token of guidance, encouragement to keep faith. Every moment of attention to detail became a piece of her spiritual training, teaching her to listen, to observe, and to trust in forces beyond what was visible. By the time she lay down to rest at night, her thoughts were no longer dominated by fear or despair. Instead, she felt the growing certainty of empowerment, the awakening of destiny that could not be denied. The whispers, dreams, and signs coalesced into an inner compass, pointing toward a future where she would rise above cruelty and oppression. The seeds of hope planted by these subtle messages took root deeply, promising a day when her life, once constrained by shadows, would bloom fully into light. After many months under the oppressive rule of her stepmother, the young girl began to realize that endurance alone would not be enough to reclaim her life. Each day brought a new humiliation, yet with it came lessons in patience and observation. She learned to move silently, to anticipate the stepmother's moods, and to note the hidden vulnerabilities in her household. Every command to scrub, fetch, or cook became an opportunity to study the environment, how doors creaked, how servants moved, and how the stepmother's pride created blind spots. She noticed the inconsistencies in her oppressors, the moments when arrogance blinded them, the secrets they carried, and the ways they relied on assumptions rather than scrutiny. These observations formed the foundation of a secret plan that only she knew and nurtured quietly in the corners of her mind. Her patience became a weapon in itself. Rather than reacting impulsively to cruelty, she learned to respond with quiet precision. Each act of obedience, each silent compliance, became part of a larger strategy, allowing her stepmother to underestimate her. This concealment of intent strengthened her resolve. She became a master of invisibility in her own home, unseen yet ever watchful. Through careful attention, she began to identify the patterns of her stepmother's arrogance and the villagers' complacency. They assumed they controlled the narrative, yet the girl, though bound by servitude, quietly accumulated knowledge and insight that would later turn the tide in her favor. At the same time, she honed her skills, both practical and mental. Chores became lessons in efficiency, strategy, and creativity. She learned to craft solutions under pressure, to use minimal resources cleverly, and to manage time with precision. Each small success, however insignificant it seemed at the moment, bolstered her confidence. Her mind, sharpened by necessity, transformed each day into training for the greater challenge that loomed ahead. She realized that survival was not enough. Mastery over her circumstances required intelligence, cunning, and clarity of purpose. Spiritual insight played an equally crucial role in her strategy. The whispers of ancestors, the subtle signs in nature, and dreams that visited her at night were interpreted as guidance. They taught her to recognize when to act and when to wait, when to conserve strength and when to assert it. These lessons grounded her, ensuring that her emerging plan was not fueled solely by anger but guided by wisdom and moral clarity. She understood that revenge was not merely about punishment, it was about restoration, balance, and justice. The spiritual whispers reminded her that power is most potent when used judiciously, blending intelligence with empathy and insight. Her growing inner strength became a wellspring of resolve, converting the anger that had once burned destructively into careful, focused energy. Each observation, each act of cunning, each whispered guidance from the spirits contributed to a strategy that would unfold like a carefully choreographed dance. She realized that patience, wisdom, and strength were far more potent than raw defiance. Her stepmother believed she had subdued a frightened child, but in truth she was nurturing a queen in waiting, a mind capable of seeing paths that others could not. By combining mental acuity, patience, and spiritual insight, she prepared herself for the inevitable moment when endurance alone would no longer suffice. The plan was not yet visible to anyone but her. It lived quietly in her thoughts and in the spaces between the day's labor. But in those quiet, hidden moments she felt a stirring of power, a certainty that she was no longer merely a servant under the stepmother's thumb. She was a force of change, quietly assembling the pieces that would transform her life and reclaim the dignity that had been stolen. Every act of observation, every silent note of weakness discovered, brought her closer to the day when her secret plan would no longer be hidden, and when the shadows that had confined her would finally give way to light. After months of careful planning and quiet observation, the young girl began to notice subtle shifts in her world. The smallest victories became milestones, each one a spark that ignited a sense of power she had never known before. She learned to earn the trust of those around her, loyal servants, villagers, or even animals who seemed to sense her purity of heart. These allies, once oblivious to her inner strength, began to recognize her intelligence and quiet command. They offered small favors, guidance, or discreet aid, unaware that she was already weaving the strands of a larger plan that would one day shift the balance of her entire world. Her mastery of skills, once driven merely by necessity, began to serve a broader purpose. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, and tending the home were no longer chores alone. They became tools of subtle influence and demonstration of competence. She discovered clever ways to optimize tasks, to resolve conflicts quietly, and to gain information without attracting suspicion. Even the smallest manipulations, redirecting gossip, discreetly correcting mistakes, or subtly highlighting the faults of her stepmother, reinforced her growing authority. In these quiet, calculated acts, her presence began to command respect, even if those around her remained unaware of its true source. Alongside these tangible accomplishments, hints of something beyond the natural world began to appear. The whispers of ancestors grew more frequent, almost tangible, guiding her steps with cryptic advice. Occasionally she noticed unusual signs, a sudden gust of wind that seemed to clear obstacles in her path, a flickering light that illuminated a hidden truth, or a subtle feeling of warmth and courage that surged unexpectedly in moments of fear. Though these manifestations were subtle, they filled her with confidence and a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere human capability. It was as if the universe itself had begun to acknowledge her strength and guide her toward a destiny she was only beginning to understand. Her cleverness extended into social interactions, where she quietly navigated the dynamics of the household and village. She noticed how the stepmother's arrogance created blind spots, how gossip could be gently redirected, and how small gestures could sow loyalty or uncertainty in the right hearts. With each successful maneuver, her sense of empowerment deepened. It was not loud or dramatic. It was the steady accumulation of influence and authority that was invisible to those who believed her powerless. Her enemies underestimated her at every turn, giving her freedom to grow stronger under their very noses. Every triumph, no matter how small, carried the seed of confidence and resilience. She began to see herself not as a victim but as a force in the making. Her mind, once clouded with despair, was now a crucible for strategy, creativity, and moral clarity. She realized that true power was not brute force but the ability to act with precision, patience, and insight. The more she mastered her environment, the more she recognized the interplay between human cunning and spiritual guidance, understanding that her path to liberation would require both. By combining the loyalty of allies, mastery of practical skills, and subtle signs of spiritual aid, she began to feel the first glimmer of her true power. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable, an awakening that hinted at the transformation to come. Where once she had been meek and fearful, now she carried a presence that commanded attention in ways that others could not yet articulate. Her stepmother continued her cruelty, unaware that the girl's ascent had already begun. Each small victory and hint of supernatural guidance was a step toward reclaiming dignity, authority, and ultimately, the throne that life had denied her. The night air was thick with anticipation, yet calm enough to mask the trembling excitement within her. After months of careful observation, patient endurance, and subtle victories, the young girl finally reached a point where remaining under her stepmother's oppressive rule was no longer a choice. It was a danger to her very spirit. Every look of scorn, every petty humiliation, and every task meant to break her had instead sharpened her mind and strengthened her resolve. She moved quietly through the house, careful to avoid the stepmother's wandering eyes and the prying curiosity of servants who might report her actions. Each step was measured, deliberate, and purposeful, a testament to the inner power that had been building silently over months of hardship. Her escape was not dramatic, it was deliberate. She had learned that true liberation comes not from frantic running but from careful timing, patience, and a thorough understanding of the environment. She slipped past the creaking floorboards and shadowed hallways, her heart steady despite the fear that gnawed at the edges of her mind. Every obstacle she encountered, the locked doors, the watchful servants, and the vigilant stepmother, was anticipated and navigated with quiet intelligence. She had mastered the household's rhythms and hidden corners, and now she used that knowledge to carve a path toward freedom. As she moved through the village, the oppressive weight that had clouded her shoulders for so long began to lift. The world outside her home felt both familiar and strange, illuminated by the moonlight and the whispers of the night wind. Her senses were heightened. The slightest rustle of leaves or distant footstep could have been a threat, but they also served as a reminder of her acute awareness, her readiness, and her control. It was in this quiet, precise movement that the first signs of her transformation became visible. Her posture was no longer bent with servitude but straight with quiet authority. Her steps carried an almost imperceptible rhythm, like the pulse of someone who knows her own power is awakening. Symbols of change began to appear around her, subtle yet undeniable. The river's gentle ripples seemed to part slightly as she passed, the wind carried a warmth that felt almost like encouragement, and even the fireflies seemed drawn to her presence, illuminating her path with tiny sparks of light. These signs were neither boastful nor frightening, they were quiet affirmations, manifestations of the ancestral support that had guided her in the shadows of oppression. She felt their strength surging through her veins, a silent but relentless force that promised her liberation and hinted at the awe-inspiring presence she was becoming. Every step forward carried both exhilaration and tension. Freedom was not without danger, and the knowledge that the stepmother or villagers might attempt to stop her kept her senses sharp. Yet fear was tempered by confidence. She had endured months of cruelty, humiliation, and labor, each one honing her mind, her strategy, and her patience. Now, her liberation was a natural extension of that resilience, a breakthrough born not of reckless impulse but of long-simmering power. Her escape was both physical and symbolic. It represented the shedding of the chains her stepmother had imposed, the breaking of a cycle of cruelty, and the first real act of agency in her life. She realized that the transformation within her was no longer dependent on external circumstances. It had become a force of its own. The quiet awe she inspired in animals, nature, and even the subtle energies around her was a precursor to the larger, more visible change that would soon unfold in the village and beyond. As the night deepened, she paused on a hill overlooking the village, breathing in the freedom she had carved for herself. Her shadow stretched long and commanding under the moonlight, a symbol of the power she now carried silently. Every hardship endured, every insult absorbed, and every act of patience and cunning had culminated in this moment. She was no longer merely a girl oppressed by cruelty, she was on the cusp of becoming a force to be reckoned with, a presence that would inspire awe, command respect, and ultimately rise to claim the life and dignity that had long been denied to her. Her breakthrough was complete, quiet, precise, and unstoppable. The path ahead was uncertain, yet illuminated by her inner fire, a fire born of endurance, intelligence, and the first glimmers of the supernatural support that had always been at her side. She stepped forward into the night, not as a victim, but as a girl in transformation, ready to reclaim her life and ascend to the greatness that awaited her. The sun was just beginning its climb over the distant hills when a quiet shift rippled through the village. The markets bustled as usual, the children chased one another along dusty streets, and elders whispered among themselves about daily affairs. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, an unspoken tension began to grow. For the first time in months, the air seemed to carry a weight of anticipation, a feeling that something remarkable was approaching. Then, as if summoned by the collective memory of injustice and endurance, she appeared at the edge of the village. She moved with the grace of someone who had known hardship and emerged from it transformed. No longer bent by labor, hunger, or the endless commands of her stepmother, her posture radiated quiet authority. Every step she took was deliberate, measured, and imbued with a power that was impossible to ignore. Even from a distance, the villagers felt her presence, not loud, not demanding, but undeniable. It was as if the earth itself recognized her resilience and whispered approval through the rustling leaves and shifting sands beneath her feet. Her eyes, once filled with uncertainty and silent sorrow, now burned with controlled fire, a subtle glow that hinted at the strength she had gained in the shadows of oppression. The women who had once mocked her paused mid-conversation, their laughter dying on their lips as an inexplicable unease crept into their hearts. Children instinctively quieted, sensing an aura that was both protective and commanding. The men in the village, accustomed to authority but unprepared for this, instinctively stepped back, their casual arrogance tempered by instinctive reverence. As she walked deeper into the village, subtle changes seemed to respond to her presence. Doors that had always closed firmly in her face appeared to open slightly at her approach. The wind shifted to flow gently around her, carrying whispers of her past endurance and the unseen forces that had guided her. Even the animals seemed to acknowledge her arrival, stepping aside or gazing at her with an almost human awareness. It was as if the village itself recognized that she had returned not merely as a person, but as an embodiment of justice, wisdom, and strength that had grown quietly, imperceptibly during her time away. Her stepmother, who had once commanded her life with relentless cruelty, felt the shift most keenly. The small household that had once been a place of control and domination now seemed suffocating, shadowed by an unspoken dread. The former tormentors, too, could sense a subtle majesty in her presence, something intangible yet profoundly powerful. Their casual confidence, born of cruelty and social complacency, began to falter. Every glance at her carried a weight of fear, a recognition that the girl they had scorned and oppressed was no longer confined by their petty rules. Yet she did not raise her voice. She did not demand recognition or declare vengeance aloud. Her power was quiet, sovereign, and inescapable, conveyed in every measured movement, every calm glance, and every step that resonated with unyielding purpose. The villagers, who had once dismissed her suffering as ordinary, could now feel the gravity of her return, as if every injustice they had witnessed or ignored was reflected back at them through the aura she exuded. She paused in the central square, her gaze sweeping over the familiar faces of those who had once ruled over her with cruelty. The air seemed to shimmer around her, a subtle hint of the inner strength and wisdom that had been forged in silence. Villagers instinctively gave her space, their whispers falling into sudden, respectful silence. The stepmother's hands trembled slightly, and a shadow of fear passed across her face, an acknowledgement that the scales had shifted irrevocably. Even those who had been neutral observers felt the change, sensing that the girl's return was more than physical, it was spiritual, moral, and symbolic. She carried with her the authority of someone who had endured, learned, and transformed. It was a presence that demanded respect without demanding submission, a reminder that the powerless, once awakened, could wield influence beyond ordinary comprehension. With every step further into the village, the tension thickened. Whispers of awe and quiet fear followed her movements, for the girl who had once been a servant was now a figure of undeniable power. Her return was not loud or violent, but its impact was immediate and lasting. A subtle, unstoppable force that redefined the boundaries of authority, justice, and respect. The village, for all its traditions and routines, had been irrevocably changed by her quiet march through its streets, a living testament to the endurance and rise of one who had suffered but would never again be subdued. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the village, when she finally arrived at the heart of her stepmother's domain. The small house, once filled with the stepmother's prideful laughter and sharp commands, now seemed diminished under the weight of the girl's presence. Every plank, every worn mat, every window reflected not warmth or comfort, but the gravity of what was coming. The villagers, drawn to the scene by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and awe, gathered at a respectful distance. Even they could sense that something beyond ordinary authority had returned to the village, something that would not allow injustice to stand. Her eyes met her stepmother's across the threshold. The woman's face, once so commanding, was now etched with tension, confusion, and a flicker of fear. The smugness that had driven her cruelty melted in an instant, replaced by the recognition of power she had never anticipated. The young woman did not speak immediately. Instead, she let her gaze travel over the space, the broken objects, the traces of selfishness, the echoes of the suffering inflicted upon her. Each detail carried the weight of memory, and each memory carried with it an invisible judgment. The stepmother attempted to speak first, her voice trembling as she tried to reclaim authority she no longer possessed. I did what I thought necessary," she stammered, her eyes darting nervously to the crowd. You cannot." But the girl's presence silenced her before she could continue. It was not an act of threat or anger, it was the quiet assertion of moral and spiritual authority, a force that made false words crumble under their own weight. The villagers could feel it too, the unmistakable shift in balance between what had been and what must now be. Every act of cruelty committed in the past, every moment of oppression, now faced a reckoning. The girl raised a hand, not in anger but in command. The air around her seemed to shift. The very space carried a heavy, almost sacred expectation. The stepmother's servants and the neighbors who had once looked away now realized the depth of the injustice they had witnessed. They could feel it pressing upon them, asking silently, urgently, whether they had done enough to protect, to intervene, to act justly. The girl's gaze swept over them, and though she spared the innocent, the weight of their conscience made them tremble. Then, the subtle forces she had cultivated during her years of hardship began to manifest. Objects moved gently under her will, a plate slid across the floor not to strike, but to signify her control over the space. A flame flickered in the hearth, reflecting the inner fire that had been nurtured by years of endurance and spiritual guidance. The stepmother shrank back instinctively, as if the girl's quiet authority carried with it the ability to render every lie, every act of cruelty transparent. She spoke at last, her voice calm, unwavering, and resonant with the wisdom of suffering endured and lessons learned. You taught me to endure. You taught me to hide, to obey, to suffer in silence. But now the scales are set. What has been sown will be reaped, and justice will not fail to recognize its due. Each word carried weight, each syllable echoed with moral force, making those who had ignored or participated in cruelty feel the shift deep within themselves. The stepmother cried out, pleading for mercy, attempting to bargain, but the girl's eyes reflected neither hatred nor malice. Her wrath was not petty, it was the righteous manifestation of justice earned through suffering. Every act of cruelty was met with a symbolic punishment. Furniture rearranged to trap the stepmother in her own hubris, the heat of a spiritual flame highlighting every deceit she had committed, the whispered voices of ancestors recounting every injustice. No physical harm befell the innocent. Children playing nearby, neighbors who had shown kindness, and those who had stayed neutral were untouched, even shielded by the quiet yet potent force she embodied. The villagers watched in awe and silent acknowledgement. Each act of judgment was precise, intentional, and meaningful. They saw the stepmother shudder under the weight of her own conscience, saw the petty tyrants of the village hesitate, reconsider, and sometimes weep as they realized the harm they had caused. The punishment was never cruel beyond the measure of justice. It was corrective, revealing the truth, reflecting the consequences of one's actions back onto the guilty. As the confrontation progressed, the stepmother fell to her knees, shivering under the moral clarity imposed upon her. I am sorry," she whispered, and it was clear that this confession was not merely a plea, but an acknowledgement of the truth she had long denied. The girl's gaze softened slightly, recognizing that justice, while firm, also allowed for repentance and growth. Mercy, tempered by righteousness, was part of the reckoning. By nightfall, the house had been transformed, not by fire or destruction, but by the undeniable presence of truth and moral order. The stepmother and her co-conspirators were subdued not by force but by the realization of the weight of their own actions. The innocent had been spared entirely. They moved freely, witnessing the display of justice and understanding that virtue and integrity held a protective power that cruelty could never overcome. The girl stepped outside, her presence commanding both respect and reverence. The villagers, who had gathered at a safe distance, began to understand the depth of her journey and the power of endurance, patience, and moral clarity. The confrontation was over, but its lessons would linger. Cruelty carries consequences, the oppressed can rise with authority, and justice guided by moral and spiritual insight is unstoppable. As she walked away from the house, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow that seemed to crown her in quiet majesty. She had reclaimed her dignity, imposed justice, and ensured that the innocent remained untouched. The village, forever changed, would remember that day, not for the punishment inflicted, but for the moral clarity and balance restored by one who had suffered and risen above it. The morning sun spilled golden light across the village, illuminating streets, gardens, and homes that had once seemed ordinary but now carried the weight of a story that would never be forgotten. Word had spread quickly. She who had endured unimaginable cruelty, who had survived years under the oppressive rule of her stepmother, would now be honored not merely as a survivor but as a leader. The villagers, young and old, gathered in anticipation, their faces a mix of reverence, curiosity, and quiet hope. For they had witnessed the power of endurance and moral justice firsthand, and now they would see the culmination of a journey that had transformed suffering into authority. She emerged from the quiet house at the edge of the village, not with fanfare or pomp, but with a presence that immediately commanded attention. Her bearing was regal, not because of adornments or titles, but because of the quiet strength that radiated from every step, every glance, every measured movement. The hardships she had endured, years of servitude, humiliation, and relentless labor, were etched into her, but they were not scars of weakness. They were the foundation of wisdom and resilience that now crowned her in an aura far more powerful than any material symbol of royalty. Villagers fell into respectful silence as she walked through the streets. Children peered from behind walls, mothers clasped their hands in awe, and elders nodded knowingly. Even the stepmother, who had once ruled the household with petty cruelty, cowered at the sight, a mix of guilt and recognition etching her features. But there was no vengeance in the young woman's gaze now, only the calm authority of someone who had learned the true measure of justice and mercy. At the village square, a makeshift throne awaited her, not as an emblem of tyranny, but as a symbol of restoration. The elders, the spiritual leaders, and the people who had long awaited a figure of moral and ethical guidance assembled. They began the traditional rites, each movement and word infused with the acknowledgement of what had been endured, what had been witnessed, and what had been learned. She knelt briefly, offering silent prayers of gratitude to her ancestors who had guided her through the darkest hours. The whispers of the past mingled with the wind, carrying a promise of vigilance, fairness, and protection. When she finally rose, it was as if the village itself leaned forward in recognition. Her coronation was not merely a ceremony, it was a statement of transformation. Those who had oppressed her were now reminded that cruelty never triumphs over resilience. Those who had aided or remained neutral were reassured that integrity and patience do not go unnoticed. Every gesture, every word spoken by the elders, reinforced that leadership was now inseparable from moral authority, and that the young woman embodied both in perfect balance. The villagers, inspired by her journey, began to celebrate with quiet reverence. Songs were sung that recounted her hardships and triumphs. Dances mimicked the journey from servitude to sovereignty. The marketplace buzzed not with gossip but with admiration, as people reflected on their own actions and vowed to align themselves with fairness and compassion. Even the children, some of whom had witnessed her suffering firsthand, felt the awe of possibility, that those who endure, those who maintain integrity in the face of cruelty, can rise above and shape the destiny of many. Her stepmother and those who had once jeered or mocked were allowed to remain, but their place had changed. They were witnesses, not participants, in the unfolding of a new era. The young woman's reign was not punitive, it was instructive. She established guidelines, small at first, but rooted in equity, fair labor, respect for elders, protection of the vulnerable, and recognition of merit over favoritism. Every decision she made was a reflection of the lessons learned during years of hardship. Compassion tempered by wisdom, authority balanced with empathy, and vigilance informed by experience. Beyond governance, her presence transformed the culture of the village. Children learned that strength was not in domination, but in endurance and moral clarity. Young women were taught that beauty, kindness, and resilience could never be diminished by envy or cruelty. Elders imparted stories of her rise as cautionary tales to those who would consider abusing power, but also as inspiration for those who sought to uphold justice. The village had, in essence, become a living testament to her journey, an ecosystem of respect, fairness, and collective awareness of morality. The ceremony continued long into the afternoon, yet there was no sense of exhaustion. Every face radiated hope, understanding, and reverence. She moved among the people, speaking with each of them, listening to their concerns, offering guidance that was wise yet compassionate. It was clear that her authority was not enforced through fear, but earned through demonstration of patience, resilience, and unwavering moral compass. The villagers now understood that true leadership is never inherited. It is forged in fire, in adversity, and in the mastery of one's own spirit. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the square, she stood at the highest point, looking over her village. She could see the roofs, the fields, the paths where she had once trudged in servitude, and a quiet smile touched her lips. The journey from oppression to sovereignty had been arduous, but it had culminated in a transformation not just of herself, but of the village itself. A new era had begun, one where justice, empathy, and respect were the pillars of community, and where the story of a girl who rose from slavery to queen would echo for generations to come. Her coronation was complete, not as an end, but as the beginning of an era where cruelty was met with consequence, resilience was celebrated, and the people knew that leadership rooted in morality was the most enduring form of power. The village, once shadowed by oppression, now thrived under the guidance of one who had walked through darkness and emerged not only unbroken but illuminated, an eternal symbol of courage, wisdom, and transformative justice.